Okay, great. So basically I'm going to try and talk to you today for about 30 minutes. I'll set my alarm so I don't run over. If I do, just throw things at me. We're going to talk about traumatic brain injury. Some of the science that's been done. This is really the work of three individuals. One is Sarge Patel, he's here right now. Another one is Dr. Eric Guzik. He's not here right now, but I'm going to talk a little bit about his stuff as well. Okay, the one thing, just want to point out, the brain is complex. So when you think about computers as being complex, they generally have about 7.1 billion transistors. The human brain is running about, depending on who you are, about 100 to 500 trillion synapses. So you can see there's a lot more synapses, and synapses are actually connections between neurons that are actually responsible for transferring and transmitting information. So the human brain, compared to a computer, is extremely complex. So what happens in a brain injury? There's basically a couple things that happen, but generally your skull is designed to protect your brain. And within that skull there's fluid called cerebrospinal fluid that keeps the brain buffered. So it acts as kind of a force reduction system. But when you hit your head, generally what happens in a concussion, the brain slams forward into the front of the skull and then it bounces back and it hits the back of the skull. So many times when you have a head injury, you're not only getting injury to one part of the brain, you're getting injury to multiple parts of the brain. If you think about your brain as a giant fatty sack, which is basically what it is, it's a giant chunk of fat, and you put a stress on that, it shapes and twists and contorts and molds, and when that occurs, you get tearing and shearing of these cells called neurons. And the neurons are what make connections, and those connections are critical for the function of the brain. And so in this head injury, you're actually torquing that brain around and it's shearing those neurons, and that's what's causing issues for individuals days, months, and years after the injury. Generally what happens is there's a primary and a secondary damage pattern. The primary, you have bleeding into the brain, the actual tissue is damaged. Sometimes there's lacerations where the brain actually tears. And then what happens after that is a secondary injury pattern. They have edema, which is just a fancy word for fluid buildup in the brain. You have impaired metabolism, meaning that you can't utilize glucose in your cells as efficiently. You have altered blood flow. There's also free radical formation, which is just a fancy way of saying that metabolic byproducts from these neurons build up and interfere with the processing of the brain. And there's this other term, excitotoxicity, which involves basically too much neurotransmitter release in the brain, and that excessive neurotransmitter release actually causes damage. So you can see that the brain is broken out into different sections. And these basically have different tasks, but they all interrelate. So you have the frontal lobe, parietal, occipital. This is involved in vision. The frontal lobe is involved in executive memory function. These are two areas that are commonly damaged. Especially when you get that forward, back and forth motion, the frontal lobe will be damaged, and that's a lobe that's responsible for you making decisions in your life. So a lot of people that have TBIs, after their injury, they'll do things that don't make sense. You're like, why did you do this? These are things you would ordinarily do. And a big reason for that is they've had frontal lobe damage, and so their executive function is impaired. So they can't make decisions rationally as they had before. You can see right here that the skull is around here, and then in between the skull and the brain is that thin layer of fluid that actually protects it. But you can see right here that a very hard impact is not going to stop that brain from impacting the skull. And so it works for lighter impacts, but when the forces get to a certain level, you can't stop that injury from occurring. So what are some of the effects that happen? They're basically, we break them out into cognitive, behavioral, motor, and sensory with some somatic signs and symptoms. So one of the big the big ones that tend to persist is cognitive. So a lot of individuals that have had head injury in the days and weeks and months after that injury will have difficulty in remembering things. They'll have difficulty in making decisions correctly. They'll have difficulty in balancing their checkbook, or sometimes they'll engage in spontaneous behavior. Thank you. I'm sorry. I've got gigantic ears, so probably not designed for me. I mean, the elephant ear model. Okay. So they'll do things that don't make sense, but that's not a product of who they are. That's a product of the damage and how that damage pattern moves through. Another issue they have are behavioral and emotional issues. Sometimes they'll have delusions.
Joel, can you help him with it, please?
That's fine.
Sure, you can. I can stick with it. They have delusions, hallucinations, severe mood disturbances, this irrational behavior. The thing that I want to point out that's really unique about TBI is that these things happen even in individuals that don't have a severe head injury. So a lot of times when you go to an emergency room physician, they're gonna classify your brain injury. They're gonna say, okay, you're mild, or you're moderate, or you're severe. The thing that's really unique about TBI is that even individuals that have a mild injury, they still have many of these symptoms. So there's not a dose effect. You'll have individuals that have a skull fracture. They'll have a very severe head injury. They'll take time to recover. They'll manifest these symptoms. But you'll still see these symptoms in individuals that have mild injuries as well. We don't know why that happens. Sometimes they'll have changes in their muscle tone. A lot of times if you've seen someone immediately after they have a concussion, if they get knocked out, their hands and feet will curl in like this. They'll pull in. Kevin had talked about, he calls it T-Rexing.
Making horses.
Making horses. Their hands will curl in like this, and that's indicating they've had motor damage and they have kind of a spasticity. They have changes many times in vision, hearing, and light sensitivity, and those are symptoms that can persist for months and years after the injury. So this is from a study, I think it's at UCLA, and it looked at the brains of individuals that had a TBI, and these are white matter tracts. The white matter tracts are responsible for transmitting information in the brain. This is an uninjured individual. This is an individual with TBI. And you can see this, I believe this individual had multiple injuries and they had persistent symptoms, and you can see how the white matter tracts and these connections in the brain have changed dramatically over time. That individual is not going to be the same person they were before. I like this slide because it shows, here's an 8. You can hit that guy in the head with a hammer, he's good to go. Yeah. These things, he's going to bury them in you. This is a human skull, and you can see it's very, very different. It's had to expand greatly to cram in that gigantic brain that Mr. 8-Man didn't have to worry about. And so you can see that over time, this has changed. This brain is not the same. This skull is not the same. And it does as a good job as it can to protect, but there's so much brain in there, into that skull, that the skull, it can only do so much to protect. So just a little bit of information about the leading causes. So 41% are falls. And then a lot of times this happens in children, it happens in the elderly. About 16% are blunt trauma. Motor vehicle accidents comprise about 15%. Assaults are about 11%. The 19% unknown or other, I don't know where that comes from. I wish I did. Do they go to the ER and be like, gosh, I don't know how I had a concussion, I just don't know. So I don't know what to say about that. But you can see where falls, and this happens to so many people, it's very, very common. Falls can happen to anyone, anytime, especially in the wintertime when it's icy. You get people that are elderly, even people that aren't elderly. This winter, if you were here, it was pretty slick. So there were a lot of people falling all over the place. A lot of them had concussions. What is the impact? So every year there's 50,000 deaths. There's 280,000 hospitalizations, about 2.2 million ER visits. That number doesn't accurately reflect how many people actually have concussions, because many people that have a mild injury will not seek medical treatment. They just don't. They're like, I know there's nothing they can do for me. I think I'm okay. They don't go on to seek care. So this number is probably much, much higher than that. In Montana, it's a huge issue. We're ranked second in the nation per capita. So we have roughly 13 to 15% of adults living with TBI. We have over 120,000 veterans living in the state, and 18% of those served in Desert Storm, Desert Shield, Afghanistan. And so you can see on the far side over there, it costs $77 billion per year in the US to take care of individuals that have had a traumatic brain injury. It's a very serious, both economic and social issue. Okay, so these are numbers that we've derived out of the literature. So some of the long-term effects. One thing that I want to make really, really clear is that with the basic research right now, individuals that have concussions, about 80% of those individuals recover completely normally. So everyone's like, oh, concussions are bad. Well, they are bad, but with enough rest and enough care and the proper medical treatment, about 80% recover normally. There's about 20%, and we found this in the research as well as other research, there's about 20% that don't recover normally, and no one seems to know why that is. But for those individuals that do not, that your risk of depression goes up 9.3-fold, your risk of drug and alcohol abuse goes up 26.4-fold. Domestic violence, they see a 5.7-fold increase in domestic violence, a 4.1-fold increase in mood disorders, and a 16.7% fold increase in anxiety. So you can see that individuals that suffer from long-term symptoms, they're at risk for a whole host of disorders that can be directly attributed to head injury. So what is concussion? What is TBI? You don't have to get knocked unconscious to be considered to have a concussion. So a lot of times, individuals that have a concussion that are diagnosed by a physician don't actually lose consciousness. They don't actually have post-traumatic amnesia. It becomes much more serious if you have a loss of consciousness longer than 5 minutes, if you have post-traumatic amnesia longer than 24 hours. That means you can't remember anything that happened. You got knocked out, and the next thing you remember is 3 days later. But that happens, and that's still considered concussion. For a comparison, the US military, they consider it mild if you are knocked unconscious for less than 30 minutes. They consider it severe if you're unconscious for more than 24 hours. So you can see that there's a disparity between the civilian world and the military world in how they classify mild, moderate, and severe injuries. But generally, a concussion is considered a loss of consciousness of less than 5 minutes and post-traumatic amnesia that lasts less than 24 hours. However, there are many physicians emergency room physicians that will test individuals that have not had a loss of consciousness that score as they've had a concussion. And so the diagnosis and current methods, it's generally just self-report. That's a huge problem because you get athletes that come off the field and they say, how are you feeling? Tell me what you're feeling. How many fingers am I holding up? Well, if you're not blind, you can probably pick out how many fingers are holding up. If you're really that bad a shape, yes, you should definitely go to the doctor. But holding up the old finger test, how many holding up? Like 3. You're gonna go, get back. That's really not the best way to diagnose it. And so a lot of what Sarge and what we're trying to do is come up with better methods that are more scientific that can accurately diagnose if they've had a concussion. Another problem is no one knows how to diagnose recovery. And so that's a huge issue because when do you send this kid back in to play football? When do you send him back in to do these other activities? And we're not saying that you can't send them back in because you can have a concussion and you can recover just fine. What we want to do is determine when you fully recovered so that if you go back in and you have another injury, you're going to be okay. You're not going to have permanent brain damage. That's a big purpose of what we're trying to do with the research. Another reason that drug therapies have failed because they've come up with about 300 different drugs to try and help you with TBI, to give to you after the injury. The reason why those haven't worked is because they have no good measure of the drug's efficacy. So they'll give you the drug and they get down to 3 months later and they have the GOSI, the extended outcome scale, and it's basically a lot of self-report symptoms, and they're like, well, we don't know if it worked or not. And so having molecular tools to actually measure whether a drug is working or not is hugely important. And then post-concussion syndrome and CTE. Post-concussion syndrome just refers to individuals that have symptoms such as nausea, dizziness, memory loss, sensitivity to light and noise after their injury. We're currently working on trying to develop biomarkers for chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is a neurodegenerative disease that occurs, and you probably heard about it in the news, it occurs due to repeated head trauma. And so we're working to try and figure out a way to diagnose that prior to post-mortem examination. Okay, so our big study, Sarge is really leading this. He's a molecular biologist. He came up with the idea. I didn't. I wish I could claim it. If he wasn't here, I'd claim it. It's my idea. It says here he knows. Is to utilize microRNAs, and microRNAs are very, very small molecules that actually, I know you guys are like, science, what is this? I hate these diagrams. Basically, microRNAs are small molecules that bind to messenger RNA from the DNA, and they stop protein synthesis. So they actually modulate proteins. They're actually inhibitory. So under normal circumstances, that's all the squiggly line talk I'll do. So normally, microRNAs are there to help regulate the protein synthesis and keep everything working correctly. When you have a head injury, what we found is that you have an abnormal production of microRNAs. And that shouldn't be happening. It should be very tightly regulated, but it's not. We don't know why the head injury causes these to increase. We don't know why it's disrupting protein synthesis, but we know that it's happening in individuals that have head trauma. So we've done three different studies. We did a study in individuals that have acute TBI, and we found that the microRNA could not only tell us what the severity of their injury was, but it could assess recovery over 30 days. So in severe individuals, we measured the microRNAs and they were very high initially, and they came down over time, but they were still high at 30 days. However, in individuals that had a mild injury, they were elevated initially, but they came down significantly by 30 days. And blinded, we could pick out who was mild, moderate, and severe, both at the 30 days and at day 0. So this is exciting. I mean, it's still preliminary. We have more work to do. We need more patients. But it shows that they may be able to diagnose individuals right after they've had a concussion and at 30 days. We also did a study in football players at UM and individuals that had a concussion and had persistent symptoms, individuals that had a concussion but no persistent symptoms, and individuals that played football that never had a concussion. And in those individuals that had persistent symptoms, we were able to measure elevated microRNAs on average 9 months after their injury. And so we're working to try and get this to feasibility where we can have this available for individuals and say, okay, I've had 4 concussions, I don't feel really well, can you measure my microRNAs? Am I okay, or is this something else? And so that's a big drive of the research we're trying to do right now at UM. We're also doing ocular testing, and you can see ocular testing is really, really cool for traumatic brain injury diagnosis because the whole optical system runs through the entire brain. And so what we've been finding with ocular testing is that individuals that have head injuries, they have abnormal eye movement. So when something is moving side to side, they don't track it normally. They have delays. And so we've been using this technology to bring in individuals that have had a concussion or have had severe head injury and say, okay, look, track this light, we're gonna tape your eyes, we're gonna videotape them, and we're gonna pick up how well you track that and how many delays you have. What we found in individuals that are having persistent symptoms from concussion, their eyes don't move smoothly. They'll get to the end near the dot and they'll start doing these little movements to correct. And we're pretty certain that's an indicator that the fibers and the tracks through that system have been damaged, and the brain is compensating to try and pick up that dot as you would normally. So the third thing that we're doing is we developed this system called Virtual Mind. And what we did is it's a new cognitive testing device using virtual reality. We brought Kevin over and we ran him through it as one of our guinea pigs. He did quite well. It's a novel cognitive testing device that actually uses a virtual reality environment. So it's current testing for concussion a lot of times is done using an impact test or a SCAT-3, and they're either paper and pencil or computer tests. One of the problems is individuals that have head injuries, they have difficulty in focusing. So you put them down in front of a paper and pencil test, you put them down in front of a computer test, they have difficulty focusing long enough for you to get a valid idea. And so what this is doing, we've developed new tests where the individual is actually engaged inside the testing environment. We control everything. We control what they hear, what they see. We can do a whole new set of tests that measure 8 different areas of the brain based on this testing device. And so this is one of the things we've been developing. And we want to do the cognitive testing, the eye tracking all together, and the MicroRNA as a system for diagnosis. So that when you get a head injury, you can come in and say, look, I've got a head injury, I need some help. We can run you through this battery, and then a month later or 3 months later, we can run you through the same battery and cross-compare those two and say, yeah, you are recovering. You do look better. You've shown recovery. You're okay to go back and play. You're okay to go back and steer wrestle or whatever you want to do. Or, no, you need more time to rest, then you can go back safely. So this just kind of shows you a little bit of what we're doing with that system. You can have someone do it sitting down or standing up. These are images taken from inside the game. We have a little avatar in there that can help you if the directions are difficult. But we've been trying to refine it and we make it scalable. So if an individual, if they're having trouble or they're not at a certain level with memory, we can scale it back so they don't get frustrated. So we're trying to get an accurate measure of what they can actually do. And I was telling Kevin today, it's almost like load testing them. We're trying to put them under a bit of a stressor, under a bit of a pressure cognitively to see how well they perform. Okay. 7 minutes. Okay. I just wanted to thank Gina Evans, who was a big part in organizing this, Dr. Patrick Beretta, and Laurel. Sarge Patel and Eric Guzik. Sarge is on the molecular side. Eric is on the VR system. I basically hang around eating chips waiting to do something so that I can take credit for it. There's Diane Brooks and Fred Roderick, who are technicians who help us. And then funding for these projects that we've just really briefly shown you was the Montana Research and Economic Development Initiative, the Montana Board of Research and Commercialization Technology, and part of the money was from the GE Head Health Challenge that Sarge and I won. Do I have any questions or anything? Oh, are there any questions?
I have a question. I was thinking about trying hyperbaric chamber, and what is your thought on that?
No, that's a good question. Yeah, she's a hyperbaric chamber, which is basically where they put you into a very high oxygen pressurized tank.
Atmospheric pressure.
You're going atmospheric?
Under atmospheric.
Under atmospheric? What's the percentage of oxygen you need?
The percentage of oxygen, I don't know, but they're, like 1.3 to 1.5, this particular. I need to get out my notes, because I asked about it. So, 1.3 to 1.5 ATA. And
It's an atmosphere, yeah, your atmosphere,
and
yeah.
that's as far as that particular tank goes. And the oxygen, they didn't say how much.
The short, truthful answer is, I really don't know. They've done it and they've had mixed results. So they've done some studies where there's a colonel, I can't remember his name, with the Army, he swears by it. He's been driving it.
Yes. Yeah.
And he says hyperbaric is the way to go. It will bring you back. I really don't know, because there's been some independent peer-reviewed studies that have been done, and they're like, hyperbaric is garbage. It doesn't do anything. There's no help. I don't know. I really don't. I wish I could provide you with better information.
I I did listen to his talk, Dr. Wright.
Yes,
He was
Colonel
on-
Wright, yeah.
A few years ago, so
He's a
Like
huge
her.
proponent of it. He's a
Yeah.
huge proponent. And so, and I respect him. He's a very knowledgeable individual. I just don't know.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
With regard to your microRNA testing, have you been able to determine how much disability might be resulting or the length, duration of disability based on what you're seeing with the amount of protein blockers?
We don't have the specific microRNA pinpointed for a specific disability. So almost all the people that come to us are long-term individuals. The three complaints they have are difficulty concentrating, memory loss, and headaches. That seems to be the three that all of them say they have. In those groups, all of them had elevated microRNAs. But which one of those microRNAs is affecting a specific issue, we don't know. We don't know.
What medicine would you prescribe for a TBI?
Well, since I'm not an MD, I wouldn't prescribe anything. I have to hedge my bets on that.
What was the question?
If you were, what medicine would you prescribe for a TBI? Let me give you my disclaimer. I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't make any recommendations. We have talked to people that have come through that have said they have had good success on Adderall. So we've had 4 or 5 individuals that have said, once my doctor put me on Adderall, I saw an enormous improvement. Adderall is it's an ADHD drug. It's a dexamphetamine D-L isomer. But yeah, they've had really good luck with that. I don't know that that's been scientifically validated. That's merely what people have said.
How do you test the microRNA?
Right, what we do is, there's a process called polymerase chain reaction. And so when they're in the blood, we take the blood out, we spin it down, we remove the plasma.
So it's through blood.
Yeah, through blood, I'm sorry, yeah. There's been some talk about saliva testing really recently. There's someone that came out with a mouth swab for microRNA with saliva. I don't know if the jury's still out on that, whether that's going to be effective or not, because generally saliva has a lot of contaminants in it. But yeah, it's blood we think is the best, by far the best. Okay.